Hello, and welcome. Tonight, let's step into the dust, into the long creaking silence of the open plains, where wheels groaned beneath canvas and families chased promises over rocks and rivers. This is the story of what it really meant to travel the Old West in a covered wagon. Not the romantic version whispered in storybooks, but the true, aching tale of days so long they bent time, and nights so cold they stole the breath from your chest. Forget what you think you know. These weren't pleasure rides. These were journeys through storms and starvation, through swollen rivers and endless dust. There were no roads, no maps worth trusting, no rescue if things went wrong. Just wooden wheels, worn boots, and the hope that what lay westward was worth everything you carried and everything you lost. If you enjoy these soft, slow drifts into forgotten history, you're warmly welcome to subscribe, or simply stay and listen. And if you'd like, you can share where you're listening from tonight. There's something quiet and beautiful about knowing we're all falling asleep together, scattered across miles, yet connected by memory. Now hush your thoughts. Let the day fade, and come with me to the trailhead, to the wagon tongue, to the place where every story west began, with a single, cracking whip. The first mile was always the hardest. What if I told you that the first step westward, the first mile on the trail, was the one that broke more people than the mountain passes, the desert heat, or even the bitter winds of Wyoming? That long before rattlesnakes, cholera, or wagon fires ever threatened a soul, it was that first creak of the axle, that first day away from home, that turned strong people soft and sent the unsure quietly back home. Because the trail didn't wait to punish you. It tested you from the very first hoof print. Picture it. A dusty lot just outside Independence, Missouri. The year is 1848. It's barely morning, but the sun's already warming the dirt. You're one of 200 souls gathered to begin a journey that might last 5 months, if you're lucky. Your wagon is heavy. The oxen are already sweating. Your boots are new, stiff against your ankles. And somewhere behind you, the life you knew is shrinking like a dot on the horizon. Everyone is trying to act brave. Fathers tighten the ropes, pretending they aren't scared. Mothers smile too much, whispering comfort they don't fully believe. Children point at birds, or chase the wheels with laughter, not realizing they won't laugh like that again for weeks. And you, maybe you're just breathing slowly, trying to hold your stomach in place as the wagon lurches forward for the first time. The trail out of town is narrow, and already the ruts are deep. Not made by nature, but by all the wagons that came before you. Thousands of them. Deep grooves that slice the earth like scars, each one a reminder that others came here, others walked this way, and not all of them made it out the other side. You can hear it now. The groaning wood, the moan of the canvas as it shifts in the wind, the sharp bark of the oxen, and behind it all, the slow, rhythmic crunch of wheels grinding over gravel and bone-dry grass. No music, no talking, just the sound of forward motion, and the aching silence of leaving something behind. By noon, the heat is real. Your shirt sticks. Your mouth is dry. The water you brought in barrels already tastes stale. The bread is hard, the jerky is saltier than you remember, and the air is full of dust kicked up by the wagons ahead of you. Dust that sticks in your teeth, coats your tongue, clogs your nose. People are already complaining. Someone twisted an ankle. Someone's wagon won't steer. A child has gone missing, only to be found behind a tree, weeping and asking for the feather bed you left back in Kansas. A woman won't stop crying, and no one knows what to say. You look ahead, expecting the trail to open, but it only narrows. Just dirt, trees, and sky over and over and over again. And then you feel it, that little ache in your shoulders, the burning on the back of your neck, the place where your boot rubs raw with each step. The journey has just begun, but your body is already mourning the comfort of a real bed. The smell of fresh bread, the sound of chickens pecking behind your fence. You reach the first camp spot by twilight. It's not much, a field near a creek, no shelter but canvas, no welcome but the howls of coyotes in the hills. You pull your bedding from the wagon, stiff wool blankets, lumpy straw pillows, and try to eat something before night steals your sight. But the firewood is wet. The wind is strong. The beans won't boil. You chew jerky until your jaw aches. Sip tepid water. Watch the stars come out one by one until they feel like strangers staring down at you. Around you, other wagons settle into silence. Some cry quietly. Some pray. Some whisper letters in their heads they'll never get to send. And one man, alone near his wagon wheel, simply stares westward, as if trying to see the whole trail in the dark. That first night, few sleep well. The ground is hard. The insects never stop. The wind rattles the canvas like fingers on bone. And every creak of a tree branch becomes a robber in the dark. Every rustle of grass becomes a bear. Your mind won't stop spinning, not with fear exactly, but with weight, with the size of what you've done, what you've started. Because this isn't a trip, it's a crossing. A line has been drawn, one foot in the old world, one in the new, and all that connects them is the trail, brutal, beautiful, and utterly indifferent. By morning, 2 families will turn back. One wagon lost a wheel, another lost nerve. They pack up quietly, faces pale, eyes down, and return to Missouri like ghosts. No one blames them. No one mocks them. Because the rest of you are wondering if they were the wise ones. But still, you go on. You patch the wheel. You adjust the loads. You tie your boots tighter and lift your sore legs into place. The oxen groan. The wheels creak. And the first whip crack of the morning splits the dawn like a pistol shot. You're moving again. And something strange happens. Even with the pain. Even with the fear. Something in your chest feels bigger, stronger. You've survived the first mile, the hardest one. And even though you know there are worse to come, rivers, cholera, hunger, snow, something quiet rises in your chest. A kind of courage, a kind of peace, a kind of truth. The West isn't just out there, it's in here too. Inside your ribs, slow and steady. You don't smile, you don't sing, but you go. And that's what makes all the difference. We'll take a deeper look at the wagons themselves, how they were built, what they carried, and how the very bones of these wooden beasts determined who lived and who didn't. Bones of the beast. Inside the covered wagon. What if I told you that your chances of surviving the Old West weren't just in your willpower, your prayers, or the strength of your oxen, but in the very boards beneath your boots? That the wagon itself, plain, creaking, wooden, was more than just a cart. It was your home, your shelter, your coffin waiting to decide? Because out on the trail, your wagon was everything, and everything depended on it. Let's start with the name. The Prairie Schooner. It sounds romantic, doesn't it? Like a ship crossing waves of golden grass. And that's exactly what it looked like from afar. White canvas rising and falling across the plains like sails. But up close, there was no illusion. It was a wooden box on wheels. And it was built for survival, not comfort. The average covered wagon was about 10 feet long, 4 feet wide, and barely high enough to stand in. No springs, no shock absorbers, just 4 wheels, a floor of rough boards, and an arched frame holding up oiled canvas that might keep out the rain. if you were lucky. The canvas was stretched tight, coated in linseed oil to resist moisture, and tied down with ropes that frayed in wind and cracked in sun. It wasn't a house, but it had to be. Inside, you packed your whole life. Barrels of flour, sacks of salt pork, jars of pickled eggs, dried beans, cornmeal, coffee, sugar, sometimes dried apples or molasses if you were lucky. Crates of tools, hammers, nails, spare parts, medicine chests with camphor and laudanum and too many bandages, and clothing, woolen dresses, long underwear, socks knit by hand. Everything had to be organized just so. Heavy items on the bottom, breakables wrapped in quilts, tools secured to the sides, rifles and pistols placed where they could be grabbed in a heartbeat. And don't forget the water barrels, sloshing and precious, hung on the side or tied at the back. There was never enough space. People fought over what to bring and what to leave. A piano? Too heavy. A rocking chair? Maybe. China plates? Pretty, but foolish. And sometimes, out on the trail, even treasured things got tossed, left behind beside the road like the bones of dreams. There are diaries filled with bitter lines. We left Ma's mirror behind today. She cried. The weight mattered more than anyone wanted to believe. Too heavy, and your oxen would die. Too light, and you might go hungry. Balance was everything. Many wagons broke before the first river crossing. Wheels cracked, axles splintered, canvas torn in sudden storms. And if you didn't know how to fix it, you were finished. And it wasn't just what you packed, it was how you lived in it. Most families didn't ride inside. That was for children, sick relatives, or those too weak to walk. The rest walked beside it. Day after day, mile after mile, boots kicking up dust as they trudged along the same ruts carved by thousands before them. Sleeping inside, only when it stormed. Most nights you made camp nearby. The wagon served as storage and shelter, not comfort. People slept on the ground, beneath the stars, or beneath the wagon itself. If it rained, you tied the canvas tighter and hoped it didn't leak. But the wagon was more than a box. It became something else over time. It was your kitchen. You cooked beside it, using the tailgate as a prep table. You fried bacon over coals dug into the earth. You stirred beans in a hanging pot while dust coated your sleeves. The smell of smoke and salt hung in the air like a constant lullaby. It was your lookout. You stood atop it, scanning for rivers, riders, and buffalo. You learned to read the horizon the way a sailor reads the sea, for movement, for menace, for miracle. It was your refuge. When wolves howled or strangers approached, you huddled behind its wheels, rifle in hand, praying it would hold. And sometimes, it was your grave. When cholera came fast, and it did, often, people died within hours. They were buried beside the trail, marked with rocks, a name carved into wood. And if you had to move too fast, you didn't bury them at all. You wrapped them in a blanket and left them in the wagon until the next camp. "We lost Samuel today," one woman wrote. "We kept him with us until the river. Then we said goodbye, and still the wagon rolled on. It squeaked in protest, it jolted on ruts. It groaned under weight, but it rolled. It carried your hopes, your food, your children, your past. It never apologized. It never stopped. And if you treated it right, it just might get you through. But it took care. Wheels had to be greased constantly. Pine tar and animal fat mixed into a black smear. Axles needed checking daily. The canvas had to be patched after every storm, sometimes sewn with fishing line or twine when nothing else held. And when something truly broke, a wheel shattered, a tongue snapped, you either fixed it or you stayed behind. Abandoned wagons dotted the trail like bleached bones, picked clean by wind and vultures. There's a quote carved into the frame of an old wagon found half buried in the grasslands of Nebraska. "She carried us as far as she could, then she gave up. So did we." Because the wagon wasn't just wood. It was spirit, it was promise. And sometimes it was the only thing keeping you upright. Even today, if you walk the trails, the Oregon, the California, the Mormon, you can find grooves in the earth where wheels once rolled. Deep, permanent, like scars on the land. They haven't faded, they might never, just like the people who pulled those wagons forward, foot by aching foot, mile by unforgiving mile. We'll leave the wagon for a moment and walk beside the people who walked the whole way, sometimes hundreds of miles in thin shoes, under hot sun, with blistered feet and hearts heavy with more than just miles. Blistered miles. The ones who walked the whole way. What if I told you that the vast majority of pioneers didn't ride in the wagon at all? That for hundreds of miles through plains, deserts, rivers, and mountains, they didn't sit, they walked? And not for exercise, not for pleasure, but because there was no other choice. Because walking was how you survived. The wagon was too heavy, the oxen too slow, the space too scarce. So if you had legs that could move, you used them, every single day. Let's begin with the morning. You wake up stiff, cold. The dew has soaked your blanket. Your boots, left outside the tent flap, are wet with mist. But there's no time to complain. The bell clangs, faint but sharp, and already you hear the snort of oxen and the groan of leather harnesses tightening across broad shoulders. You slip on damp socks. You wrap your sore feet in rags. You lace the boots tight and hope the raw skin doesn't tear again. You eat a cold biscuit. Maybe sip bitter coffee from a shared tin cup, and then you start walking. Before the sun's up, before your eyes are even fully open. There's no break. The wheels roll slow, pulled by animals more stubborn than strong. The ground crunches beneath your boots, dry and brittle one day, mud-slick and dangerous the next. Sometimes the ruts are so deep your ankles twist. Other times the dust flies so thick you cough dry for hours. But still, you walk. Men, women, children, all on foot. Fathers leading teams with cracked whips. Mothers balancing babies on their hips. Girls no older than 10 carrying water pails. Boys already stooped with the weight of bags slung across their shoulders. No one is spared unless they're ill or too young to stand. And even then, only sometimes. Some walked in silence. Some sang hymns, ballads, old country songs. Anything to push the miles past. But the silence always came back. It always did. Because after 15 miles a day, on rough terrain, in ill-fitting boots, your thoughts grow quiet. Your world shrinks to the rhythm of your feet and the feel of gravel beneath your soles. Some wore holes through 3 pairs of shoes before Wyoming. Others walked barefoot when the soles split, binding feet in cloth or rawhide, limping onward until the next supply point, which might be 100 miles away. Blisters were expected. Infections were feared. A simple cut could turn red and swollen. A toenail lost could become gangrene. And in an era before antibiotics, you didn't wait too long to treat it. Or it might be the end of your journey, and not because of distance. There are stories of men who walked until their feet bled, then stuffed grass into their boots to cushion the pain. Of mothers who carried children by day and still walked beside the wagon all night. Of children so small they had to run to keep up. And yet, no one complained. Or if they did, they whispered it to the sky. Because walking meant you were still alive. Still moving forward, still chasing whatever waited at the end of the horizon. Some saw it as penance. Some saw it as freedom. A preacher wrote, I walk because the Lord gave me legs, and each step is one closer to the garden He has prepared for us. A widow wrote, I walk because my husband cannot. He died in Missouri. I carry his tools on my back. And a boy, just 11, scribbled, I walked behind Ma today. She didn't cry like yesterday. We saw a deer. I wish we could eat it. Walking wasn't just a physical act. It was emotional, spiritual, personal. It was how people kept their minds clear, their tempers cool, their grief soft. There were no therapists on the trail, no books to distract you, just wind and sky and pain, and your own breath steady in your chest. And sometimes miracles happened. A stranger would offer a hand. A teamster would pull you onto his wagon bench for an hour's rest. A child would find a patch of wild berries and hand you the sweetest one. A breeze would cut the dust just long enough to let your lungs remember what air really tasted like. Those moments stayed with people longer than the miles. They remembered the kindness, not the blisters. They remembered the hand that pulled them across the muddy ravine, not the mud. And by the time they reached the Rockies, swollen feet, sunburnt faces, clothes turned to rags, something unbreakable had grown inside them. A kind of steel, a quiet pride. They hadn't just survived the trail, they'd walked it, with their own 2 feet. Every painful, beautiful step. And when they finally stepped down into Oregon, or California, or the salt flats of Utah, they didn't run. They didn't shout. They just stood, barefoot on new earth, and cried. Not for the pain, but for the fact that they'd made it, that they hadn't stopped, that every aching mile was now behind them. There's a pair of shoes, preserved in a museum in Oregon, cracked, misshapen, nearly soulless. A woman wore them from Missouri to the Willamette Valley. She gave birth on the trail, buried a son by the Platte River, and still walked the rest of the way. Next to the shoes is her diary. One entry reads, My feet are blood, but they carried me here. Thank God. We'll feel the fear rise as we wade into the rivers of the West, because water wasn't always life out here. Sometimes it was death, and crossing it in a creaking wagon full of hope and weight took more than bravery. It took luck, skill, and prayers whispered into the current. River crossings, when the water took what the land let go. What if I told you that the biggest fear on the trail wasn't bandits or bears, but water? That when your wagon train reached the edge of a river, the bravest men went quiet, the children stopped laughing, and the women held their breath, because everyone knew the truth. The land might wear you down, but water could take you in a single moment. And on the trail west, rivers weren't just obstacles. They were judgment. Picture it. The morning mist is still clinging to the tall grass. A blue ribbon of water snakes through the valley ahead. The Platte, the Green, the Snake, or worse yet, the Missouri. It doesn't matter, they all mean the same thing. Danger. The wagons pull up short, wheels creaking to a stop. The oxen stomp and snort. You walk to the edge, and what you see isn't peaceful. It's powerful. The current isn't gentle. It's swift, brown, and cold. You can't see the bottom. You don't know how deep it runs, but you know what it's taken. The river is rising. It's mid-spring. Snowmelt from the Rockies has turned this creek into a floodplain. Just 2 days ago, someone ahead of you tried to ford it and didn't make it. There's a man upstream, waist-deep in the current, poking the riverbed with a long stick, measuring depth. His face is tight. He's not optimistic. The water's fast, the bottom soft, the banks muddy. It's a bad crossing, but the only one for 50 miles. You have 3 options. You can wait, hope it lowers, but that costs time, and time costs food. You can pay a ferry, if there is one, but you've already spent too much, and there's no guarantee the raft will hold your load. Or you cross, you risk it. You waterproof the wagon, or try to. You seal the seams with pitch and tar, wrap the canvas tighter, lash your belongings down. The oxen are restless. They sense what's coming. So do the children. One girl buries her doll, afraid it won't survive. A boy whispers to the Bible in his pocket, pressing it to his chest like a shield. When it's your turn, there's no turning back. The wagon creaks forward, the wheels finding the bank, then the slope, then water, cold, fast. The oxen plunge in. You walk beside them, waist deep, your hands gripping the yoke. The current pushes hard. The wheels catch, the wagon tilts. Everyone holds their breath. It's not dramatic, it's slow, terrifying. Silent save for the groaning wood, the slap of the current, and your own breath heaving in panic. Then, something shifts. A wheel catches a rock. The wagon tips. A barrel breaks loose. Flour spills into the water like ghost dust. A child screams. You yank the reins. The oxen push forward, muscles straining, nostrils flaring. The canvas sags. The tailgate dips. Water surges inside. This is how people drown. Not in oceans, but in rivers barely 30 feet across. Not all made it. Some were swept away. Some were pinned beneath wagons. Some survived the crossing only to find everything soaked. Food ruined, medicine lost, tools rusted. One woman wrote in her journal, "We lost the coffee, the books, the bread, and the piano legs, but kept the baby. Praise God." They buried more than people at riverbanks. Broken wheels, soaked flour, shattered chests of china. The past, left behind in muddy water. Some didn't even try to recover it. They just stared at the river, too tired to weep. Yet somehow, most of them made it across. With ropes, with pulleys, with prayers. With neighbors knee-deep in mud, shouting directions, pulling with blistered hands. Sometimes they floated the wagons. Sometimes they built rafts. Sometimes they stripped everything down and carried it piece by piece. Because no matter how deep the river ran, the need to cross it always ran deeper. There were quiet moments, too. After the chaos. After the rescue. After the fire was built and the wet clothes hung to dry. A tin cup of coffee passed hand to hand. A dry blanket shared. A story told to remind everyone they were still alive. One night, a man sat by the fire and said, "The river took my chest of books, but left me the one in my coat." He pulled out a small psalter. Maybe that's all I needed. Rivers marked chapters on the trail. They were pages turned by current and courage. You remembered each one. The Platte, where we buried our third ox. The Snake, where we nearly lost Sarah. The Missouri, where I learned I could swim. These crossings etched themselves into memory. Even children, decades later, would describe them with reverence. The chill, the noise, the strange calm that came after. The way their father looked, not scared, but still, when the wagon floated for just 1 second, free from land and fate. Because in those moments, you didn't know if you'd reach the other side. But you stepped in anyway. That was the West. Not the land you claimed, but the fear you faced and walked through and never forgot. We'll climb into the belly of the trail's greatest dread, disease. Not bullets or storms, but the invisible killers, cholera, dysentery, fever, that swept through wagon camps like wildfire, leaving silence in their wake. And how families tried to survive with little more than whiskey, prayer, and each other. Death in the dust, when disease rode the trail. What if I told you the most dangerous enemy on the trail wasn't hiding behind a rock with a rifle? It was already inside the camp. That it crept in with the wind, with the water, with the cough of a child, or the quiet moan of a man trying not to worry his wife. Disease, not gunfights, claimed more lives on the wagon roads west. And when it came quick. No warning, no mercy, just a name whispered between canvas sheets. Cholera. You wake before dawn. The fire's low, the air is still, but something feels wrong. One of the children, a boy maybe 7, has been vomiting since midnight. He's pale, cold. His lips are blue. His mother wraps him in a quilt and calls for the doctor, but there is no doctor. Just an old man who used to pull teeth in St. Louis and carries a satchel of dried herbs and whiskey. He kneels beside the boy, feels his pulse, whispers something the family can't hear, then stands and walks away, shaking his head. By breakfast, the boy is gone. He wasn't the first, and he won't be the last. Cholera was the great leveler. It didn't care if you were strong, or pious, or young. If you drank from the wrong stream, one used by wagons ahead of you for bathing, laundry, or worse, it might already be in your belly. It could take hold in hours, and once it did, you had little time. There are journals from 1850 that read like death tolls. Buried 4 today, 3 last night, 22 ill. The second wagon lost all but the father. He carries on alone. Sawdust soaked in vomit. Smell beyond words. No more clean linens. There were other illnesses too, dysentery, smallpox, typhoid. But cholera struck terror like no other. It came fast. It came hard. It emptied your body until there was nothing left. Until even your voice was gone. People tried everything. They boiled water when they could, burned bedding, buried the dead far from camp. They hung herbs from the canvas, lit smudge fires, sprinkled vinegar on their hands, and whispered prayers in languages older than America itself. Some wore amulets. Some slept with a Bible against their chest. All feared the silence. The worst was when it took more than one. A father and mother both ill, too weak to bury their own child. A wagon driven by a 12-year-old girl after both her parents died within 2 days. Neighbors helped when they could, but everyone was afraid. Not of violence, but of breath, of water, of touch. They tried to keep spirits high. They sang hymns, told stories, boiled sassafras tea, said things like, "It's just the grip," or "She's just tired." But they knew. Everyone knew. Once the moaning started, once the lips turned gray, it was only a matter of time. And yet they stayed kind. Even at the edge of panic, they sat with the dying, held hands slick with sweat, fed sips of water from cracked cups, whispered final words, sometimes their own, sometimes on behalf of those too weak to speak. A woman named Abigail wrote, "I held her head while she went. She was 16. She smelled like wild mint. I cut a braid to give her mother, but we buried her before sunrise." They buried quickly. Shallow graves, wood crosses, sometimes just a pile of rocks to keep the wolves away. In dry soil, it was easier, but in wet, they used spoons. Shovels broke. Fingernails tore, but they dug. They always dug. And the wagons moved on, always on. That was the brutal part. There was no time to mourn, no time to stay. The trail demanded forward motion. The dead were left behind, not forgotten, never forgotten, but left just the same. The survivors became harder, quieter, but not cruel. They helped each other, shared vinegar when they had it, lent blankets, poured water over the fevered, sat in silence beside those with no family left. There was no heroism in it, just necessity. They knew that kindness, like cholera, could spread, and it was the only thing stronger. A child's lullaby sung beside a sick stranger, a crust of bread left for a grieving man, a hand extended in fear but held anyway. And when the trail reached the place where grass returned and rivers ran clean, they said it felt like waking up from a fever dream. They never forgot the ones they lost. They spoke their names in the evenings, pointed at stars and said, "That one looks like her," or "He always loved the moon." In museums today, you'll find hair pressed into Bibles, tiny shoes packed in oiled cloth, lockets with initials carved in grief. Reminders that the trail west wasn't paved with gold. It was carved from loss, and the people who made it through didn't forget the price. They couldn't, because death rode with them in the dust, in the water, in the silence between campfires. And still, they walked. We'll climb into the wind and scale the mountains, the steep passes, the rocky switchbacks, the places where wheels broke, oxen fell, and travelers had to lighten the load by tossing what they once swore they couldn't live without. The mountains didn't just test your body, they tested your soul into the mountains, where the trail turned to stone. What if I told you the mountains weren't just a part of the journey? They were the great test. The one thing every pioneer feared long before the trail turned upward. Because it wasn't just elevation, it was exhaustion, starvation, and sacrifice stacked mile after mile into a silent wall of stone. You didn't reach the mountains reached for you, and once they did, there was no way back. You either climbed or you died where you stood. You could always see them coming. Days before the first incline, the Rockies announced themselves in jagged silhouettes against the sky. Blue-gray at dawn, burning gold by noon, black as soot by nightfall. You'd stare and whisper, "Are those clouds?" Until someone said, "No, that's the edge of everything." And from then on, every creak of your wagon felt heavier. Every mile grew colder. You wrapped the children tighter, packed more carefully, left behind the things you knew you couldn't drag over rock. The ascent began slowly, deceptive. A rise so gentle you didn't notice the oxen straining more, or the way your boots slipped just slightly with each step. But the wind changed, colder, sharper, and the trees, once full and green, grew stunted and gray, like they'd already given up. Then came the switchbacks. The trail twisted like a snake with a broken spine. Narrow, rocky, no room for error. On one side, loose gravel sloped into nothing. On the other, sheer cliffs rose like iron walls, and in the middle, you, your family, your wagon, your hopes, and every pound of flour, tools, and memory creaking inside. People fell. Not often, not every day, but enough. An ox lost footing, a wagon wheel slipped. A boy ran too far ahead and didn't stop in time. They tumbled without a sound, swallowed by stone. And all you could do was watch, or not watch, and hold tighter to what you had left. Wagons broke here. The strain of the climb cracked axles, ripped canvas, splintered spokes, and if you couldn't fix it, you left it behind. There are places where the mountain trails are lined with the carcasses of wagons, some looted by scavengers, others left with notes scrawled on wood. "Too steep. Pray for us." And the worst part? You had to lighten the load. To go forward, you had to give up. People tossed trunks filled with china, books, heirlooms passed through generations. They left behind pianos, wooden cradles, framed portraits. They burned dresses too heavy to carry, tools too large to tie down. Once, a woman left a wedding dress beneath a pine tree, folded neatly with a note pinned to it. "If you make it, wear this." That's what the mountains did. They made you choose. What mattered most? What was worth your last ounce of strength? What did you love more, memory or survival? Some tried to carry too much and paid the price. The oxen collapsed, the wheels buckled, The families ran out of food long before the summit, and in the worst cases, they turned back, or died before the top, or begged help from others who were just as empty as they were. But for those who made it, the view was something close to holy. There's a moment, just past the last cruel ridge, where the sky opens. The land falls away. The clouds lie beneath your boots. You can see for 50 miles. The wind smells clean for the first time in weeks. And though your hands bleed and your back aches, and your wagon groans like it's about to split, you know you did something impossible. You conquered stone, and the mountain didn't beat you. You stood where eagles fly. And the silence? It doesn't feel empty. It feels earned. But you don't get to stay. No one stays on the summit, because the descent waits, the next climb, the desert, the cold. But now you know something the trail never wanted you to know. You're stronger than it is. We descend into the harsh reality of food and fire, into the meager meals, the ash-streaked pots, and the hunger that sat beside every campfire like a silent guest. Because out here, eating wasn't just survival, it was an act of stubborn defiance, to sit, to chew, to taste, and say, "We are still here." Chapter 7. Hunger by the Fire, when food became faith. What if I told you that one of the hardest parts of the journey west wasn't war or wolves or weather, it was dinner? That every bite was bought with blisters and silence, and every fire lit beneath a cold sky was a prayer in disguise. Because on the trail, food wasn't just nourishment. It was defiance. It was survival. It was love, served, scorched, and steaming with cracked hands and tired eyes. And when you had nothing left, you still cooked. By the time you reached camp, your body ached in places you didn't know could hurt. The wagons would form a wide circle, or a crescent if the ground was sloped. The animals were unhitched, hobbled, or tied nearby. Children slept where they dropped. And the fire, if you could find wood, became the center of everything. The iron pot swung low. The tin cups came out. The knives were wiped, not cleaned. There wasn't time for dainty habits out here. Let's start with the menu. Salt pork, beans, coffee. Over and over. If you had dried apples, they went into the beans. If you had onions, into the beans. If you had nothing, just beans. Sometimes no beans, just water boiled twice to make it feel like soup. Cornmeal fried in bacon grease. Biscuits hard as stone. And if someone was lucky enough to shoot a rabbit or a squirrel, the camp lit up with quiet joy. Not celebration, but soft relief. You cooked over flames with a stick and a prayer. Dutch ovens buried in ash. Tin pans balanced on rocks. Wooden spoons blackened from use. The smell was smoke and meat and memory. The portions were small, but no one complained. You learned to chew slowly, to savor, to make one biscuit last a mile. Coffee was gold, boiled so thick it could hold a spoon upright, sometimes brewed with beans used twice already. Sweetened with molasses if you had it, black and bitter if you didn't. And even those who didn't drink it back home came to need it, for the warmth, the wakefulness, the way it made the wind feel less sharp in your bones. But hunger was constant, even after eating. Especially then. You never got full, just less empty. A meal meant hours of energy, not comfort. It meant your hands didn't shake when you lifted your child, or that you could walk 10 more miles before resting again. Food became sacred. There are stories of children saving half a biscuit for days, cradled in cloth because it reminded them of home. Of mothers who didn't eat for 3 days so their babies could suck broth from their fingers. Of men who cried quietly into their stew, not because it tasted good, but because it tasted like something. Scarcity taught invention. They fried grasshoppers, boiled roots, baked flatbread on hot rocks, They made syrup from cactus, porridge from cornmeal thinned to water. If an ox died, they carved the meat fast and cooked it faster. Nothing wasted. Even the fat was rendered into candles, the bones into broth. One woman wrote in her diary, "We had nothing but water and old bacon ends. I made a broth with biscuit crumbs. It was the best supper I've ever had. My husband kissed my hand." They shared. Even when there wasn't enough, they shared. A spoonful passed from mother to child. A crust offered to a stranger. A pot of beans shared with the wagon behind you because they'd lost theirs in the river. Not charity, kinship. Hunger was the language everyone understood. But sometimes it wasn't enough. There were nights when the pot stayed empty, when no rabbit was caught, when no firewood was found, when the wind blew too hard and the cold crept into your fingers. On those nights, they drank water, boiled grass, chewed leather softened in ash. And still, they sat by the fire. Even when the food ran out, the ritual remained. Circle around the glow. Say a few words. Let the silence fall heavy. Whisper stories. Sing something old, even if off-key. Because the fire was more than heat. It was hope. It was a reminder that not all was lost, that the world could still glow just a little. Some nights they laughed. Jokes told in low voices. Embellished stories of towns they'd build, orchards they'd plant, pies they'd eat. They laughed not because they forgot the hunger, but because it couldn't take their voices. And other nights they cried. A spoon dropped in the dirt, a burned pan, a child asking for more. It didn't take much to break a person after weeks of scarcity, but even then, someone always stirred the ashes, passed the last crumb, kept the fire alive, because that was the rule of the trail. Eat what you can. Share what you have, keep moving. By morning, the ashes would be cold. The pots scraped clean. The last piece of jerky tucked into a pocket for later. And they'd walk on, hunger at their heels, dust in their mouths, but something warm still lingering on their tongues. A taste of courage, a taste of memory. We'll explore the hidden hours, the nights beneath the stars, where fear, love, and exhaustion all lived side by side. We'll hear the lullabies that drifted over prairie grass and feel the loneliness that came when the fire burned low and only the coyotes answered your thoughts. Because even on the trail, sleep didn't always come easy. Beneath the stars, the long, lonely nights of the trail. What if I told you the most revealing part of the journey west wasn't during the miles walked under sun, but during the hours spent lying still under stars? That when the wagon stopped groaning, when the fire fell to glowing coals and the children had fallen asleep, what was left wasn't just rest. It was reflection, longing, fear, and sometimes a strange kind of peace. Because out on the trail, night wasn't just dark. It was deep, and it reached right through your chest. Evening began quietly. After dinner, after the pots had been scrubbed with sand and river water, after the last ox had been hobbled and the ropes checked twice, people gathered near the fire, not always talking, not always laughing, but together. Some sat on boxes, some leaned against wagon wheels, some just stood, arms crossed, watching sparks drift into the dark like little bits of memory. Sometimes someone would sing, not loud, not joyful, but soft. A hymn from back home. A ballad passed down from a grandmother's lips. A child's lullaby, whispered into the wind. The kind of songs that made you close your eyes, because opening them meant remembering where you were, and how far you still had to go. There was a rhythm to these nights. Mothers mending socks in the last light, fathers checking wagon spokes with calloused fingers, older children gathering bundles of dry grass to pad a sleeping spot, and always the same slow preparation, rolling out the blankets, shaking out the bugs, pulling canvas tight in the case of rain. There were no beds on the trail, no pillows, just earth and wool and each other. When the fire faded, the stillness began, and that's when it hit the hardest. The ache in your back, the buzz of your thoughts, the way your heart seemed to echo in the space around you. Some nights, it was too quiet. So quiet you could hear a man 3 wagons away shift in his sleep. Hear a baby sigh. Hear your own regrets rustling in your chest. Others not quiet enough. Wolves howled. Coyotes barked. Horses snorted in alarm. The wind turned cruel, yanking canvas flaps and sending cold fingers beneath every blanket. You pulled your coat tighter, turned onto your side, whispered a prayer you weren't sure you believed anymore. And sleep? It didn't always come. Not when your boots had rubbed your feet raw. Not when you were still hungry. Not when you'd buried someone you loved that morning beside a cottonwood tree and hadn't had time to carve their name. Some stared at the stars, not to wish, but to remember. A familiar pattern of lights might bring back a night long ago, back home. A kiss beneath a barn roof. A child's first word. A hand you hadn't held in years. Out here, under the Milky Way's shimmer, every star looked older, closer, more like a witness than a wonder. Some wrote. By candlelight, ink freezing in the bottle, they wrote letters that might never be sent. To parents, to sweethearts, to the dead. Pages folded and tucked into Bibles, names scrawled in the back margins of books. Quiet proof that someone had lived, had loved, had walked this far. And still, some found comfort. In the way the wind moved through the grass, in the sound of a partner breathing steady beside them, in the shared silence of neighbors who'd become like family. Because even if the trail stripped you down to your bones, it left behind something hard to name, a kind of fierce closeness forged in dust, pain, and quiet kindness. There are accounts of people watching over the camp while others slept, taking turns with rifles across their laps, whispering to the dark, watching for shadows. Not out of paranoia, but love. The kind of love that made you keep guard, even when your eyelids burned. Some made wishes anyway, even after all the loss, even after the rivers and the mountains and the graves. They looked up, picked a star, and wished. For rain, for safety, for the strength to make it one more day. Sometimes they spoke the names of those they'd lost aloud, just once, to no one in particular, just to hear it, to keep it real, and when sleep finally came, it came like surrender. Not soft, not sweet, but full, like collapsing into the arms of something you didn't understand but needed. Blankets pulled to the chin, arms curled tight, boots placed just within reach. Because the morning would come soon, and with it, the dust, the fire, the grind of wheels and the long stretch of horizon. But for a few hours, just a few, you were still. And that stillness saved you. It reminded you why you were walking, why you hadn't turned back, why the stars still meant something. We'll open the quietest chapter yet, the memories people carried and the things they refused to let go, the photographs, the trinkets, the pieces of home wrapped in cloth and hidden deep in the wagon. Because even while chasing something new, pioneers held tightly to what was already lost and refused to let the trail take it too, the things they carried, what they couldn't leave behind. What if I told you that every wagon on the trail carried 2 kinds of weight, the kind that could be measured in pounds and the kind that couldn't? That for every sack of flour, every rifle, every bolt of cloth, there was something else hidden beneath it. something softer, stranger, sacred. Because even in the face of starvation and storms, people still made space for memory. They carried love and grief and hope, wrapped in silk, locked in wood, or folded gently between shirts. These weren't supplies. They were soul. Let's begin with the most common treasure of all, a photograph, or rather, a daguerreotype. A thin, silver plate tucked into a case of leather or gutta percha, velvet-lined, sealed with clasps. It showed faces, solemn, unsmiling, frozen in black and gray. A mother, a husband, a child too young to remember the world. These portraits didn't just preserve appearances, they held stories. You could almost hear the voice behind the eyes, the last words spoken before the frame was closed and the long walk began. They weren't always shown. Most kept them hidden, deep in a chest, beneath socks or handkerchiefs, taken out only at night, by firelight, when no one else was watching, held in two hands like something living. And when the trail grew cruel, when oxen died, or food ran low, or sickness swept the camp, it was that face that pulled you forward. Some brought letters, folded and worn, read until the edges frayed, stained with oil and tears. Letters that said, "Come west, the soil is good," or "We miss you, don't forget us." Letters that weren't always legible anymore, ink smeared, words lost, but the meaning survived. The sender's heart, frozen in script, and books. You wouldn't think books would make the cut when weight meant everything. But they came. Small Bibles, psalters, volumes of poetry wrapped in cloth, journals, recipe books passed from mothers to daughters, marked with smudges and corrections and notes like, "Too much salt if the pork is cured." Some books were never opened again. Others were read aloud at night, or whispered from memory when reading became too hard. There were trinkets. Rings worn on twine around the neck, locks of hair sealed in wax, coins too old to spend carried for luck. One man kept a pocket watch that no longer ticked, a wedding gift from a wife buried 2 states behind him. He wound it every night anyway. There was fabric, a scrap of wedding dress, a baby blanket too small for the child now toddling beside the wagon. A hand-stitched sampler with prayers sewn in crooked thread. These things didn't feed you, didn't fix wheels, but they reminded you who you were. Some carried smells. Lavender sachets, dried orange peel, a bar of soap from home, untouched, saved for when we get there. A way to bring the past into the present, even if just for a breath. And others carried sounds, a harmonica, a fiddle, a wooden flute carved from cherry. These instruments were played not to entertain, but to remember, to hold off the silence, to fill the night with something familiar, even if your fingers shook as they pressed the strings. One woman carried a shell, just one, from the coast of Maine. She had never seen the Pacific, but she'd grown up beside the Atlantic and said she could still hear it in her dreams. She held the shell to her ear every night and told her children, "This is what it sounds like when water loves the shore." And children, oh, what children carried. Rag dolls with button eyes, carved wooden animals, tiny tin cups, a piece of chalk, a feather found on the trail. Pebbles, traded like currency, each one claimed from a river or a cliff or a hill they thought looked like a sleeping bear. Children carried what they could lift, what they could believe in, and sometimes what their parents couldn't bear to leave behind themselves. You see, these things weren't practical. They were essential. They didn't weigh much, but they were heavy in the way that memory is, in the way that grief sits quietly in the back of the wagon, waiting for you to notice. And every time someone left something behind, a piano, a cradle, a chair with carved legs, they reached deeper for the thing they refused to lose. There's a story from a woman named Eliza who crossed with her husband and 4 children. They lost 2 wagons, 3 oxen, everything they thought they needed. But she never gave up her teacup, a single porcelain cup, cracked at the rim, wrapped in lace and buried in the bottom of her sewing box. She drank from it every Sunday, sitting on a rock, her back to the trail. Her husband once asked her why she kept it. She said, "Because when I hold it, I remember who I used to be." That was the point. The trail took so much. Flesh, time, comfort. These things, they gave something back. They told you you were still you, even in dust, even in hunger, even when you forgot the sound of your own laugh. And when people died, as they often did, these things became altars, laid beside a grave, tucked into a pocket, pressed into a child's palm, a ring, a button, a page torn from a book, a name written on cloth. This was his. She made this. He carried it every mile. And the others, they remembered. The man who wore 2 boots from 2 different makers, because one was his brother's. The girl who still clutched her grandmother's shawl, even in summer. The boy who sang the song his mother used to hum when the sun set behind the trees. They remembered. That was the real cargo. That was what the wagons bore. Not flour, not tools, but hearts, stories, pieces of the lives they'd already lived, packed into splintered boxes and tied down tight. And when they reached the end of the trail, when the dust gave way to grass or forest or sea, they opened those boxes, held those tokens in the new light, and wept, because they'd made it, and so had the memory. Even now, in museums and family trunks and private drawers, those things remain. A child's cup, a worn Bible, a necklace made of hair, an envelope that still smells faintly of lavender, if you breathe deep and believe. They are not just antiques, they are testaments. Proof that the trail didn't strip everyone bare, that some carried not just burdens, but love, and they never let it go. We'll turn toward the end of the road, the final stretch into Oregon, California, or Utah. We'll walk the last miles with tired eyes and blistered feet, past the graves and rivers and mountains, and into the land they dreamed about. Because after so much loss, what did it really feel like to arrive? The last miles, when the dream became dust and grass. What if I told you that the hardest part of the journey wasn't the beginning, or the river crossings, or the mountains, or the hunger? That after months of walking, after burying friends and shedding every comfort they owned, the most difficult moment of all came just before the end, when the dream was so close they could smell it, and yet still, the land refused to give them anything for free. Because the last miles, they broke people. By now, everything had changed. The wagons were lighter, not from planning, but from attrition. Wheels replaced with whatever wood could be carved. Axles bound with iron straps and prayer. Tarps patched with scraps of shirts. Shoes held together with twine. Families smaller than they had been in Missouri. Faces harder. Sun-bleached. Hollow-eyed, but still blinking toward the horizon with stubborn hope. They no longer asked how far it was, because they didn't want the answer. They simply woke up each morning, packed what was left, and kept moving. The dust clung to everything now. The inside of mouths, the folds of skirts, the seams of blankets. It had become part of them, just like the silence had. The long, stretched-out quiet of people who had seen too much and still dared to go on. They passed graves now like landmarks, names carved with the butt of a knife. Mother, EJ, age 3. Gone home. Little piles of rocks where the wolves couldn't dig. wooden crosses tilting in the wind, and they whispered as they walked past, not prayers, but names, not loud enough for anyone to hear, but the ghosts. The trails grew thinner, then split. One track to Oregon, one to the Salt Lake, one south toward the promise of California gold. And they chose, not with excitement, but with tired logic. Which wagon could make it up which slope? Which animals had strength left in their legs? Where would they find water, real water, not the kind that tasted of iron and snake tracks? But still, some dared to dream. They talked of orchards, of houses with windows, of land without fences, of schools, of shops, of Sunday mornings with bells and the smell of bread. These weren't fantasies anymore. They were survival mantras. If they stopped believing, they might stop walking. It was the children who saw it first. Green, not gray, real grass, trees that didn't look starved, flowers that bloomed without coaxing. And suddenly the air changed. It no longer smelled only of smoke and sweat, but of pine or sea or sagebrush, sweet in the wind. It smelled like possibility. Then someone would say, "We're close." But close didn't mean easy. The last miles were sometimes the steepest, the narrowest, the most dangerous, and many, too many, collapsed just before they reached the valley or the river bend or the final descent. One woman wrote, "He walked 1,800 miles and died 6 hours before we reached Oregon City. I told him we'd made it anyway." Because you had to finish. There was no glory in coming close. You had to drive the last stake, cross the last ford, feel the land flatten and spread and open up like a promise finally kept. And when they did, it didn't look like a parade. It wasn't trumpets or banners. It was a moment of silence so deep it felt like church. A man sat down in the grass and wept. A girl let go of her mother's hand and ran toward a creek just to feel cool water on her legs. A woman knelt and kissed the dirt. They didn't shout, they slept. For the first time in weeks, they took off their boots without fear of coyotes or strangers or frost. They let the oxen wander. They ate slowly. They washed their hands. And when they woke the next morning, they still couldn't believe they'd arrived. Some stayed right there. Built cabins with whatever the wagons still held. Dug cellars, planted seeds. Some moved again, further north, further west, chasing something brighter. Some never stopped chasing, but most just began again. Because the end of the trail wasn't the end of anything. It was the start of everything. The start of carving homes from wilderness, of hauling lumber and pulling stumps and praying for rain. The start of burying new loved ones, of watching new children grow, of laughing again, slowly, the way people do after they've forgotten what joy feels like. And in their cabins, they kept the things they'd carried all that way. The locket, the Bible, the cup, the scrap of cloth. They placed them on mantles, hung them on nails, hid them in drawers. They passed them on, whispered their stories by firelight, told grandchildren, "This went to the Pacific with me." You can find them still, in old trunks, in local museums, in glass cases where the light hits just right and you can see the fingerprints still pressed into the wood. They aren't antiques. They're monuments. To endurance, to loss. To a dream not just chased, but caught. And the land remembers too. The old ruts still exist, grown over in places, but visible if the light is low and you know where to look. Wagon wheels carved those scars deep. So did feet. So did hope. And when the wind moves over the hills in Oregon or Utah or along the California coast, it carries a bit of those voices. The songs, the whispers, the names murmured beside dying fires. Because the trail didn't end. It just became memory. And that memory became us. We'll return to the ones who never made it. The forgotten stories, the quiet graves, the unfinished letters. Because not every journey reached its promised end. And yet, even those whose feet failed helped carry the dream forward, through the ones who walked on, with their names etched into every mile. The forgotten. Those who never reach the end. What if I told you that some of the most powerful stories of the Trail West aren't about the ones who made it, but the ones who didn't? That not every wagon reached the river or the coast or the golden promise painted on maps. Some broke apart in the mountains. Some vanished into snow. Some were left behind, not just their names, but their stories, scattered like ash on the wind. And though they may not be carved in stone or sung in textbooks, they are there, stitched into the trail's memory. They matter still. They began just like the others, with hopes folded into flour sacks, with boots polished for the first day, with laughter around a campfire built outside St. Louis or Independence or some little town now lost to time. They were no different. They were dreamers, builders, believers. Some were too young to know what they were chasing. Others too old to know if they'd live long enough to see it. And yet, they went. But the trail is cruel. It tests without warning. One day of rain becomes 4. The river that looked passable turns to flood. A child develops a cough. A mother loses her balance and is crushed by the rear wheel. A man catches a fever and doesn't rise. A wagon wheel splits where no wood can be found to fix it. The oxen spook and run. The food spoils. The frost comes early. They fall behind. The main train keeps moving, not out of heartlessness but necessity. It's the unspoken rule. You don't stop. You slow, but you do not wait. Because waiting means hunger. Waiting means death. And when a family begins to lag, when their wheels squeal louder, when their lantern burns longer, everyone knows. Sometimes someone stays behind to help. Sometimes not. The forgotten live in those gaps, the space between help and silence, between hope and surrender, between the trail and the prairie that doesn't care who you are or where you came from. They made camp a little too far from the others. Their fire burned smaller. Their voices fell quieter. And one day they weren't seen again. Some died quickly, in accidents, in storms, in sudden sickness, buried beneath piles of rock or under trees with names etched into bark. They were given prayers, sometimes even songs, but often only silence. The dirt was pressed flat, and the wagons rolled on. Others simply stopped moving. They gave up, not because they were weak, but because everything had been taken. A mother who had lost 3 children couldn't keep walking. A husband who had buried his wife and 2 sons within 1 week sat on a rock and said, "That's as far as I go." And no one could argue. Their trail ended not in California or Oregon, but on some nameless stretch of earth, far from the finish, far from the maps, but forever part of the story. And then there were the lost. The ones who wandered off for water and never returned. The children who chased butterflies too far. The men who went hunting and didn't come back. The women who disappeared beneath waves or into snowstorms, or whose names were never even recorded. No one knows how many. There are no full lists, no records complete, just hints. A grave marked only M. A journal entry that ends mid-sentence. A rumor passed from train to train. A family ahead lost everything. No sign of them now. The trail swallowed them, and time did too. But still, they mattered, because every step they took lightened the burden for someone behind. Every camp they made left fire rings and cleared brush. Every mistake they made became a lesson for those who followed. Even in their absence, they gave something back. Some were honored. Years later, their names were carved into wooden signs along the Oregon Trail, along the Mormon route, along the California cutoff. Their graves became landmarks. Their letters, when found, were read aloud beside new campfires. Their stories, half finished, were completed in whispers. Others were forgotten. Truly, their wagons burned, their belongings scattered, their memory faded into prairie grass and mountain snow. No one marked the spot. No one passed down the name. But that doesn't mean they didn't matter. It means we owe them something now, remembrance. And some weren't lost to death, but to silence. Women who miscarried and told no one. Men who wept behind wagons where no one could see. Children who forgot the face of a sibling left behind. The trail demanded quiet strength, and so many gave it. So much that no one ever knew how deep their pain ran. You can feel them if you walk the trail today. In the quiet spots. In the places where wildflowers bloom too beautifully. In the spaces between rocks where a wheel once turned. In the wind that blows through passes named for men who never reached the other side. They are there. And sometimes, even now, a farmer in Nebraska or a rancher in Wyoming will find something in the dirt. A button, a buckle, a piece of china. And they'll stop and wonder, and maybe, just maybe, say a name aloud. Or invent one, just so the ghost has something to be called. Because none of this, none of what we are now, was built only by those who succeeded. It was built by all of them. The dreamers, the fallen, the almost there, the forgotten. And the trail doesn't remember them in words. It remembers them in dust, in silence, in the faintest traces of steps. We do not walk alone, even now. We walk with those who gave their last breath to a dream they'd never see. Who walked so others could arrive. Who believed, even as the land took everything. And in the end, maybe that's what the trail is really made of. Not ruts, not maps, but memory. We'll return to the wagons themselves, those groaning wooden giants that held the whole world in them. We'll step inside, into the cramped, creaking belly of the prairie schooner, and see what daily life looked like within its canvas walls. Because these weren't just wagons, they were kitchens, bedrooms, hospitals, and hope, all rolled into one. Life inside the wagon, the world beneath the canvas. What if I told you that every wagon on the trail was more than wood and wheels? That beneath its dusty canvas roof lived 1,000 private moments you'd never see in a painting. That inside, it wasn't just barrels and sacks, but prayers whispered at midnight. Bread baked on iron griddles, a baby's first smile, or the final breath of a fevered man. Because the prairie schooner wasn't just a vehicle. It was a world on wheels. And for many, it was the only home they knew. You would hear them before you saw them. The creak of timber, the groan of leather, the rhythmic clop of hooves, and the steady crunch of wheels against stone. Inside, the sound was softer but constant. The rustling of sacks, the clinking of spoons, the gentle lull of canvas swaying in the wind like a ship lost at sea. They called them prairie schooners for a reason. Not just because they looked like boats, but because they carried lives across an endless, shifting ocean of grass and dirt. Step inside. Mind your head. The ceiling is low, maybe 4 feet from the wagon bed to the curve of canvas above. You can't stand. Most couldn't. You crouch or kneel or move on hands and knees, brushing aside pots, satchels, tools, dried herbs hanging from wooden ribs. Everything is packed with painful precision. Nothing is wasted. Every corner stuffed. The walls are sacks. Sacks of flour, sacks of cornmeal, rice, beans, sugar if they could afford it. Barrels of salt pork. Bundles of clothing tied with rope. Boxes of nails. Jars of molasses if they were lucky. A coffee grinder lashed to a beam. A whetstone wrapped in cloth. And always, always, a water keg swaying outside, secured like treasure. The sleeping space? Thin feather beds rolled up during the day. At night, unrolled atop wooden slats, spread with quilts that smelled like home. There was no privacy, no doors, only canvas and curtain, and most didn't bother with either. If it rained, you curled tighter. If it was hot, you suffocated and prayed for wind. Children slept like kittens, curled in piles, sometimes beneath the benches, sometimes in a parent's arms. Babies were rocked in crates padded with old linen. Some wagons had wooden cradles carved by fathers in winter, passed down and tied down tight so they wouldn't slide. The air was thick. With dust, yes, but also with the scent of leather, lye soap, iron, bread, grease, candle smoke. It changed through the day. Morning smelled like damp wool and coffee. Midday like sweat and churned butter. Evening like ash and bacon and wet shoes. And always, beneath it all, the soft mildew of canvas that had seen too many rains. People lived their lives inside these boxes. They wrote letters, said their prayers, sewed buttons, taught their children to read by candlelight when the road was kind. Some even gave birth inside, on moving wheels, between cries and bumps and whispered curses. And some died there too, wrapped in sheets, buried in the clothes they wore because there was no time to change them. Inside a wagon, there was nowhere to run from your thoughts. The canvas caught sound and held it. You whispered arguments. You sang lullabies. You talked to yourself, or to the past, or to the memory of someone you'd left behind in a grave 300 miles back. Women ruled this space. It was their domain, their kitchen, their nursery, their quiet sanctuary. And though the men drove the teams and fixed the wheels, it was the women who kept the wagon alive. They measured flour with their hands, stirred pots while holding babies, knew exactly how many biscuits they could make before the lard ran out. Some wagons had stoves, small, iron, finicky. Others just had griddles that could be lifted out and set over fire. Meals were prepped inside, cooked outside, eaten on laps or flat rocks or the tailgate. And if it rained, they made do with cold bread and hope. Tools hung from hooks, lanterns from canvas loops, cups from nails driven into sideboards. The knife had a place. So did the scissors. So did the comb. And when something broke, it wasn't thrown out, it was mended. Again and again. Thread through patch through patience. They told stories here. On long evenings when the sky turned orange and the wheels had stopped. Stories of ghosts and miracles, of home and harvest, of war and weddings. Children leaned in close, eyes wide, dust streaking their cheeks, toes curling in the quilts. For those few minutes, the wagon became a stage, a temple, a cradle of memory. Some wagons were messy, chaotic bundles of smell and stuff and shouting. Others were neat, military tight, bedrolls straight, spoons polished, curtains ironed even on the trail. And some changed every week. Because people change. Out here, they changed fast. They learned to share space like sailors, to fold themselves into silence when grief filled the air, to pass the butter without asking, to close their eyes when their sister wept, to pretend the rocking of the wheels was just the sea, not the sound of everything they owned rolling toward the unknown. But there was magic, too. The magic of waking to birdsong and sunlight filtered through canvas, of a baby's giggle echoing off barrels, of your spouse's hand finding yours in the dark, of seeing a green valley from the wagon bed and whispering, "We made it." And the wagons bore it all. The love, the loss, the laughter, the aching silence. They carried joy and fear and the memory of hands held long ago. They were witness to everything, and when they finally stopped for good, when the oxen were unhitched one final time, some wagons were burned, some were turned into houses, some left to rot in the prairie, swallowed by grass and wind. But they never really disappeared, because what they carried couldn't be measured in boards, or canvas, or iron. They carried people, not just their bodies, their whole selves, their fears, their songs, their pasts, their hopes. And when you walk the old trails now, if you're quiet enough, you might hear it. The faint creak of timber, the hush of a lullaby, the soft thud of a loaf being kneaded on a wooden board. They are still out there, just beneath the grass, just beneath the stars, rolling slowly westward forever. We'll ride with the animals, the oxen, the mules, the horses who pulled the dreams of thousands mile after mile, because without them, no one would have made it. And yet their backs bore more than weight. They bore the burdens of a whole nation's hope. The beasts who carried the West, oxen, mules, and the animals of the trail. What if I told you that the westward dream didn't ride on ambition alone, but on the shoulders of beasts, that without hooves in the mud, without snorts in the cold dark, without the slow, patient strength of oxen and the wary glances of mules, no wagon would have moved an inch. The heroes of the trail weren't just men and women, they were animals, bone-tired, fly-bitten, weather-beaten, and they carried the whole weight of a nation's longing on their backs. First came the oxen, broad, slow, tireless, the beating hearts of the wagon train. Not fast, not flashy, but steady. They pulled the wagons mile after mile through dust, snow, flood, and slope. Yoked in pairs, big wooden collars around their necks, iron rings linking them together, they groaned against the weight of everything people thought they needed to survive. And when that wasn't enough, they pulled even harder. A good ox team meant the difference between life and death. They were prized not for their looks or speed, but for their will, their ability to lean into a hill and not stop, to cross a river without panicking, to stand still when wolves howled or wagons crashed. You knew a good ox by the way it looked at you, calm, resigned, but not broken. They ate everything: prairie grass, weeds, scraps. Their strength came from the land itself, from long hours of chewing and longer hours of walking. And they didn't complain, they just moved forward. Some families gave them names: Jake and Joe, Big Red, Maud and Molly. Some didn't. They didn't want to get too attached, because oxen died often, from exhaustion, from overwork, from stepping wrong in a riverbed and snapping a leg, from eating poisoned plants, from simply collapsing under the weight of too many dreams. And when an ox died, it meant more than grief. It meant stopping, repacking, rebalancing. In the worst cases, it meant walking, or leaving things behind, or watching everything fall apart. There are stories of families eating their own oxen, not from cruelty, but starvation, of men crying over the same beast they'd cursed for months, because by then it wasn't just livestock, it was family. Then came the mules, trickier, smarter, stubborn as drought, but faster, nimbler, better at finding footing in places where wheels dared not go. Mule teams were often used by those with more money: traders, scouts, explorers. They could cross steep grades that oxen feared, but they had minds of their own. They'd stop in the middle of a climb and refuse to move, sit down and protest, kick without warning. You didn't command a mule, you negotiated, pleaded, waited. But they were survivors, tougher than horses, less prone to panic, more adaptable. And when they chose to move, they moved with grace. And finally, the horses. Not the gallant stallions of dime novels, not the white chargers of cavalry dreams, but wiry trail horses, smaller, meaner, hardy. Used more for riding than pulling, they ran messages between wagons, carried scouts ahead, raced to the nearest fort for help, brought doctors when the fever set in. Sometimes they were all that stood between the train and disaster. Horses were faster but fragile. They spooked, they ran, they broke easily. They needed more food than mules or oxen. They demanded care, brushing, shoeing, protection from chill. And yet, when treated well, they became more than beasts. They became lifelines. Children loved them, whispered to them, climbed onto their backs bare-legged in stolen moments of joy. There are stories of girls riding ahead of the wagons at sunrise, their braids whipping in the wind, singing as they went, not to be brave, but because the horse beneath them gave them wings. All these animals bled, their hides rubbed raw by leather, their hooves cracked from frost, their eyes wide with fear during lightning storms. Some were born on the trail and died before seeing a single town. Some lasted to the very end and collapsed in the grass, spent but triumphant. And their deaths were always noticed. When an ox went down, the entire wagon halted. When a horse was lost, a rider dismounted in silence. When a mule died, someone cursed, someone cried, someone dug a shallow grave with the heel of their boot. Children placed wildflowers on their resting spots. Mothers whispered thanks. Fathers carved initials into nearby trees. Because these beasts, these carriers of history, had earned their rest. There was beauty in their motion, the way a team of oxen leaned as one into the harness, the way a mule found the dry path when everyone else sank into mud, the way a horse's breath steamed in the cold morning air as if exhaling memory. And trust. Trust was everything. Between beast and man, between reins and fingers, between command and obedience. In the darkest hours, it wasn't just your family you counted on. It was the thing beneath the yoke, the heartbeat beside you. The creature that didn't ask why just walked. They were never thanked properly. They didn't wear medals. They weren't mentioned in speeches, but they carried it all. The children, the food, the coffins, the dreams, mile after mile, day after day, through storm, through snow, through sickness. No complaint, no praise, just hoof and breath and motion. And when the wagons reached the end, when towns rose and fences were built and songs were sung in new chapels, some of these animals were set free, turned loose on the plains, allowed to roam, their yokes removed, their halters untied, and in that final, quiet gift, freedom, maybe they found peace, and maybe, just maybe, they found each other again, grazing in the shadow of some far-off mountain, no longer burdened, no longer bound, just breathing in the scent of the earth they helped conquer. We'll visit the towns that waited at trail's end, the muddy streets, the first shops, the hastily built cabins, because the dream didn't end with arrival. It began with building, and not all of it was as peaceful as we're led to believe. The towns at trail's end, building the dream in mud and timber. What if I told you that the end of the trail wasn't quiet, that instead of rest and celebration, the first days after arrival were the hardest of all, that after months of walking, bleeding, and burying, families stepped from wagons onto land that looked like nothing more than possibility. And possibility, it turns out, is another word for nothing. Because what lay at the end of the westward journey was not comfort, but mud, and trees that needed felling, and cold winds without mercy, and the sheer weight of beginning again with nothing but your hands, and the memory of what was left behind. There were no cities waiting with open arms. Just valleys, wide and wild. The Oregon countryside, the slopes of California, the basins of Utah. Earth packed with promise and soaked with silence. They came expecting a town. They found wilderness. And so, they built it. The first thing they built wasn't a church, or a school, or a courthouse. It was a roof. Any roof. Canvas stretched over poles. Branches lashed with rope. Sod stacked and shaped into shelter. 4 walls and a place to light a fire. That's all that mattered. Because rain was coming, or snow, or wolves, or hunger. Cabins went up overnight. 1-room rectangles with dirt floors and chimneys that smoked more inside than out. Windows covered with greased paper or glass if they'd had the coin to bring any. No insulation. Just logs and hope. Inside, the same people who'd huddled in wagons now huddled by new hearths, listening to wind howl through chinks in the wall and pretending it sounded like progress. Water came from creeks. Toilets were pits. Food was whatever had survived the journey. But they'd arrived, and that mattered. Communities formed like moss on stone, slow, quiet, persistent. A man who had once made shoes in Boston set up shop by the bend in the river. A woman who had nursed the sick on the trail offered poultices and prayers in a corner room lit by tallow. A blacksmith dug out a forge and began hammering anything with weight into something useful. And the cabins clustered closer. Paths turned to roads, and the towns began. But these towns were not peaceful. They were raw, rowdy, lawless. There were no sheriffs yet, no elected boards. There were just people with nothing to lose and everything to fight for. Arguments over land became fistfights. Disputes over water turned to gunfire. People who had survived the same trail suddenly turned on each other over fences, cows, or old grudges. And yet, the towns held, because for every fight there was also a wedding. For every theft, a shared meal. For every storm, a barn raised in a single afternoon by 20 hands working like one. The West was never just cruel. It was kind, too, fiercely, unexpectedly kind. Children were born, and not just born, raised. Their first steps were on planks laid over mud. Their first words echoed off the beams of cabins barely tall enough to stand in. And when they cried, it wasn't the sound of pain. It was the sound of the future, finding its voice. Schools came next. Sometimes just a woman with a bell and a Bible and a handful of readers. Churches followed. Sometimes only on Sundays. Sometimes every night, when hope felt too thin to stretch to morning. And stores, with flour and sugar and nails and boots and jars of candy that cost more than a week's work. They were tiny kingdoms, ruled by merchants who knew that control didn't come from gold. It came from what people couldn't live without. The towns looked like stories, smoke curling from chimneys, doors that creaked on hinges made from wagon parts, children chasing chickens between cabins, women drawing water with arms like rope, men digging furrows into land that had never known a plow. They looked like beginnings, but they felt like memory, because no matter how new the town was, it already felt old, like it had waited for them, like it had dreamed of them just as they had dreamed of it. Some towns vanished, built too close to rivers, too far from trails, too heavy with dreams and too light on water. Others grew, into cities, into capitals, into places where no one remembered how it started, just that it did. And maybe, in some attic, there's still a piece of canvas from a wagon top, folded next to a Bible and a tin plate. A reminder of how fragile it all once was. And when night came, it was still wild. Coyotes howled. Wolves prowled. The wind turned cruel. But now there were chimneys. There were lanterns. There were locks on doors. The wild was still there, but it no longer ruled. People did. People who had walked the trail. Who had carried their dead. who had built a town with blisters and songs and the sheer defiance of survival. This was the West, not a myth, but 1,000 tiny cabins glowing in the dark. We'll visit the dreams that didn't die but changed, how people adapted, reinvented themselves, and turned disappointment into destiny. Because survival wasn't just about making it. It was about making meaning from everything they'd lost and everything they hoped to find. The dreams that changed. Reinvention at the edge of the world. What if I told you the dream they left with was not the one they held when they arrived? That the promise of land, gold, and freedom morphed somewhere on the trail, reshaped by wind, loss, and the hard edges of real life. Because survival on the frontier didn't just take strength, it took surrender, not of hope, but of expectation. You came west thinking you'd build one life, and instead you built another. They called it reinvention, though most never called it anything at all. They just lived it. A banker became a farmer. A schoolteacher became a blacksmith. A runaway became a midwife. A boy of 14 became the man of the house after burying his father in a mountain pass, and none of them had time to mourn who they were before. The land didn't allow it. The sun rose and work began, and the person you used to be became a ghost. Many came for wealth. Few found it. The gold was gone by the time most got there. The land was harder to farm than the flyers had said. The towns were rougher, the winters longer. But still, they stayed. Because after the trail, you stopped believing in easy riches. You believed in work and family and food in the pantry and a door that closed against the wind. They built dreams that fit their hands. A fence, a plowed field, a dry well turned good with just a bit more digging. The dreams grew smaller but deeper. Less about glory, more about peace. The trail had taught them to love what endured. Some had come to escape debt, shame, scandal, war. The West gave them new names, new chances. Out here, no one asked where you were from, only where you were going, and who you'd help to get there. But not everyone could adapt. Some drank themselves into silence. Some vanished. Some walked into the hills and never came back. Because the land did not heal all wounds, it simply left them behind if you couldn't find a way to keep walking. Still, many did. They married strangers and built houses together. They raised stepchildren as their own. They buried old dreams beneath apple trees and planted new ones in their place. They found peace in repetition, baking bread, mending shirts, chopping wood. The small acts became sacred. And the women, the women were the architects of reinvention. They became doctors in towns without doctors, teachers in towns without schools, judges in kitchens where justice came with coffee and a firm hand. They kept journals where they wrote not just what happened, but how it felt. Their words survive now, stained with smoke and pressed between pages. Today I made it. Tomorrow I will too. And they endured things no one should, stillbirths in storm-tossed cabins, fire that took everything but a skillet, men who left and didn't return. And yet, they stayed. They stitched quilts from old dresses. They sang songs into the dark. They told their daughters, "You come from steel." The children grew like saplings, rooted in struggle, but reaching, learning to read by lantern light, to plow by 12, to shoot straight, stitch wounds, trade wisely. And they were taught not to chase riches, but to stand still and make something where they were. And some of them, the boldest ones, dreamed new dreams, of towns with libraries, of rights for women, of schools where every child sat, not just the white ones, of voting, of printing newspapers, of building something their parents couldn't even imagine. Because when a dream breaks, it doesn't always die. Sometimes it blooms sideways. It slips through the cracks and comes up wild, a different shape, but just as strong. There was a man who had wanted to be rich in California. He ended up teaching algebra to farm kids in Oregon. He said it was the best thing that ever happened to him. There was a woman who lost 3 children and a husband on the trail. She opened a boarding house and raised 7 orphans. They called her Ma. There was a black preacher who walked alone into Utah, built a church from wagon wood, and welcomed anyone who needed sanctuary. He never made a dime, but they carved his name into stone, and there were countless others. The dreamers who didn't become what they planned, but became more. Because the West didn't care what you expected. It cared what you built, what you gave, what you carried forward even when your arms trembled. They invented a new kind of success. Not wealth, not fame, but roots, but peace, but survival with soul intact. And they passed that on, in stories told on porches, in recipes, in hymns, in land deeds, in baby names, in laughter that echoed from cabins where once there had been only silence. They taught their children not to wish for comfort, but to create it. This was the West most never saw. Not the shootouts, not the gold dust, not the saloon tales, but the quiet miracle of ordinary people who dared to begin again, who dared to stay, who said, "This will be home," and meant it, no matter what came next. And in those homes, you can still feel it. In floorboards smoothed by barefoot children, in stoves blackened by 1,000 morning fires, in hand-dug wells and fences and seed rows, in photo albums wrapped in cloth and kept under beds. That's where the dream lives now. Not in myths, but in memory. Not in songs, but in silence, the kind earned only by living it. We returned to the fireside, to the stories they told at night, when the work was done, and the stars came out, and the whole journey was turned into legend for the sake of the children listening in their quilts, because sometimes truth was too hard, and so they shaped it into something soft enough to fall asleep to. Campfire myths and nighttime legends, how the West was remembered. What if I told you the most enduring part of the West wasn't written down? It was whispered, that the hardest truths were sanded smooth by moonlight and retold beneath quilts, beside fires with children half asleep and wind pressing at the shutters. Because facts may shape history, but stories are what we remember. And the trail was full of them. By the time the last plate had been scrubbed and the fire banked low, families gathered by flickering light and traded memory for legend. It didn't matter if the story was true, only if it made the children's eyes go wide and their hearts beat a little faster. It started with the simple ones. How Pa fought off a bear with nothing but a frying pan. How Ma delivered twins during a blizzard and still made supper before dusk. How a boy once outran a prairie fire by riding 2 horses, 1 foot on each saddle. No one asked how. They just listened. Because the truth didn't live in accuracy, it lived in awe. Every family had a tale. A snake in the bedroll, a ghost that walked the wagon trail. A thunderstorm so fierce it split the sky in 2 and carved a new river. And when the children leaned in, blankets tucked to their chins, eyes wide, the real magic began. Because that's when the elders whispered the old names, the names of those who hadn't made it. The cousins buried in mountain passes, the friends lost to fever, the babies who were born too early, too small, too quiet. They didn't speak them with grief. They spoke them like spells, so the names wouldn't be forgotten. Your Uncle Henry built the first bridge across Elk Creek. Your sister Ellen had eyes just like yours. Little Nathan walked every mile of the trail barefoot, said the boots made him slower. And the children listened, not with sorrow, but with reverence. Because around that fire, the past wasn't gone. It sat beside them, just out of sight, breathing, glowing, real. The myths grew over time. A man who tamed a wild buffalo and rode it into town like a king. A woman who wrestled a mountain lion off her son. A dog who led a lost wagon home after everyone else had given up. Every town had a story that wasn't quite possible, but wasn't quite false either. And as the years passed, the stories deepened. What once was hardship became heroism. What once was terror became triumph. What once was silence became song. They told them not to lie, but to soothe, to give shape to what couldn't be faced head-on. The nights that had been so cold they thought they'd die. The days without bread, the sound of wolves, the way thunder felt in your chest when you had nowhere to run. These became lessons wrapped in wonder. Be brave like your grandfather. He crossed the Rockies with a broken leg. Be strong like your mother. She gave birth with no midwife and still made it to church by Sunday. Be kind like our neighbor. He once gave away his last loaf of bread. And the children believed them. They grew up with stars in their eyes and calluses on their hands, not realizing how much of their strength had come from stories, from the gentle lies that carried truth, from the courage hidden in exaggeration. And sometimes, just sometimes, the stories were told to adults too, when grief came heavy, when crops failed, when someone disappeared, when the future seemed too wide and empty to face. That's when the stories came like balm. Remember what your father did during the flood? Remember how we crossed the pass with frozen boots and still made it to spring? If we could survive the trail, we can survive this too. Because the trail had become a metaphor, a map of resilience, a language, a shared mythology. They weren't just settlers. They were legends. Not because of what they conquered, but because of what they carried, what they kept alive, what they passed down. And when they were old, when the children they once held now held them, the stories softened again. No more beasts, no more heroics. Just quiet truth, a rocking chair, a lap. A story that began, when I was your age, we didn't have roads. And those stories still echo, not in books, but in bones, in family reunions on old homesteads, in recipes cooked the same way Nana used to make, in hands that hold tools the same way their fathers did, in lullabies that have no author, only memory, because the trail never ended. It just changed names, from prairie to town, from cabin to home, from myth to memory. And as the fire died down and the children drifted into dreams, wrapped in tales they'd tell one day themselves, the adults sat just a little longer, watching the embers, listening to the dark, thankful that the trail had brought them not just here, but to each other. We'll walk one last mile, not on the wagon road, but through the minds of those who never left the trail behind, even when they settled. Because some journeys don't end at a destination. They echo forever, in footsteps no longer heard but never truly gone. Echoes of the trail, the journey that never really ended. What if I told you the journey didn't stop when the wagons halted and cabins rose? That long after the last wheel groaned to a stop, the trail kept winding, not on maps, but in minds. Because some paths don't end at a destination. They live on, in muscle, in memory, in the hush between words. You could hear it in how they spoke. Not about miles, but about endurance. They would say, I remember that wind. It never stopped blowing. Or, after you've walked the divide barefoot, a bad crop's just another morning. The trail became a reference point. A mark by which all things were measured. Joy, loss, weather, faith. When a baby was born, they said, "She's never known the trail." When someone passed, they whispered, "He carried us through Wyoming." It wasn't nostalgia, it was reverence. Because what they survived wasn't just a route, it was a reckoning. The trail taught them not just how to survive, but how to be. And for many, it stayed inside them. They kept walking, even when their feet stood still. They rose with the sun, even in towns with clocks. They saved everything: buttons, string, bacon grease, not because they had to anymore, but because the trail had taught them waste was dangerous. Waste was death, and even the children who had never stepped on a wagon road, they inherited it. In their hands, in their caution, in the way they looked at the horizon with equal parts hope and suspicion. "Don't trust the weather," their mothers would say. "Don't count on rain. Don't build too close to the creek." Advice passed down like scripture, and in every homestead there were artifacts. A cracked lantern, a frayed map, a pair of worn boots never thrown away, a Bible with the cover long gone but pages marked with pressed flowers and burial dates. These weren't heirlooms. They were anchors. To remind them where they'd come from. To remind them that the trail wasn't a story. It was a route. You could see it in how they worked. Even after land was plowed and towns had grocers and railroads came whistling in, they still made soap from ash. Still dipped candles, still planted by the moon. Not because they didn't know better, but because they did. The trail had stripped life to its bone, and what was left was real, reliable, sacred. So they carried it forward. In church songs, in quilts that told stories in stitched patterns, in hands that reached for each other without asking. Because on the trail, survival had been collective. And even off it, they never let that part go. There was a man who never stopped wearing his trail coat. It had holes in both sleeves and half a collar, but he said it was lucky. Said it reminded him what mattered. Said it still smelled like the fire where he proposed to his wife. There was a woman who refused to move into town, even when her children begged. She said the view from her porch was the same sky she saw crossing the plains. And if she had to die, she'd die under that sky, not under someone else's roof. And there were thousands more. People who woke early, not from alarm clocks, but from something older. A memory in the bones. A whisper that said, "It's time." They lived like the trail might start again any minute. Like the wagons were still out there, just past the ridge. Like the road might call them once more, and they needed to be ready. Because, for some, the trail wasn't just history. It was identity. They didn't tell stories of conquest. They told stories of care, of sharing biscuits when the flour ran out, of carrying the weak, of singing when all else failed. And these stories shaped the West far more than any gunfight. Because what built the frontier wasn't grit alone. It was grace, compassion, endurance, the quiet kind, the kind that doesn't ask for recognition, only a little space to keep going. And those echoes lasted. Even today, in fields where wagons once rolled, in cabins still standing, in the surnames etched into fences and graves, the trail is there. Not as hardship, as heritage, the urge to keep going, to build something from nothing, to hold on to each other when everything else falls away. That's what they passed on. Not just land, not just tools, but the unspoken code: don't give up, don't leave anyone behind, make it through, and make it count. They didn't ask for thanks. They asked only that we remember. Not their names even, just the walk, just the cost, just the quiet courage it took to place one foot in front of the other, again and again and again. We'll turn to the women's journals, pages stained by firelight and childbirth, by spilled coffee and grief. and listen to what they recorded in their own words. Not the myths, not the second-hand tales, but the truth as only the women of the West could write it.